Hey there, FakeFox here. In this video I will show you my dungeon healing build for the Arcanist. Like my other dungeon builds, this is also an off-healer, so a mixture between healer and damage dealer, as I think this playstyle is more effective than playing a full healer in most 4-player content. I want to be honest with you here because there is enough clickbait content and alleged god tier builds or whatever on YouTube already. This build is, at least in my opinion, quite strong and the best you can currently do for off-healing on an Arcanist. It does have its fair share of problems though. Arcanist has ridiculous damage potential with brain-dead simple mechanics. However, it is really unresponsive because the main damage ability is a 5-second channel, and the sustain also kind of sucks. This build performs best in sort of the mid-tier content, where having healing and support feels worthwhile, but you can still focus enough on pushing the damage. But especially in the more recent hard modes, you eventually run into situations where you just can't keep up enough damage for this build to be worthwhile. In these dungeons, I personally play this build in Trash and the easier boss encounters, but then switch to full healer for the difficult ones. I will also cover how you can do that with relatively minimal effort in this video. To start things off though, let's talk about the sets. Spellpower Cure and Master Architect is probably the overall strongest and most popular set combination for healing in 4-player groups in general. Both sets work incredibly well for off-healing builds as well. We want to keep up healing anyways and use our ultimate when we need high damage, so these sets are basically passive. There are alternatives such as Olorim, Powerful Assault, Pillager's Prophet, Sexial Champion, or Roaring Opportunist, but those are noticeably weaker, especially for hybrid builds. For the secondary sets, I personally like to use Black Rose Daggers and Velothi Urmage's Amulet. It requires no additional effort and the stat combination is really good for dungeons, boosting AoE damage with penetration and critical chance, and also the damage mitigation and movement speed are also really nice. But there are also a lot of alternatives, especially for the frontbar weapon. Basically every popular DD combination also works for this build. In my opinion, dual wield is the best if you can be melee, otherwise a destruction staff. I also recommend checking out the DPS set tier lists by Skinny Cheeks for more ideas in case you aren't familiar with what damage dealers are currently wearing. Link is in the description. But going with Symphony of Blades, for example, over a mythic could also be a good idea if your group needs more sustain. If you are using an ability altering weapon, I highly recommend having Spellpower Cure always active and using a Master Architect weapon. 1-bar Spellpower Cure is certainly possible, but it is pointlessly inconvenient for off-healing. Moving on to the traits and enchantments. This build uses Magicka as the primary resource, as this makes transitioning to more healing significantly easier than if you would play stamina based. For the damage, it doesn't really matter as most Arcanist abilities have adaptive costs anyways, and this build does also always use its stamina. So we want to be using Divine Armor pieces with Magicka enchantments by default. If we permanently do need more health, I think our best option here is actually infuse prismatic enchants on head, chest and or legs, since we basically get free additional stamina for doing that. I would recommend somewhere between 22 and 25,000 health. On the jewelry, we want all infused with probably 2 damage and 1 Magicka recovery enchantment, but it also depends on other factors in your build, like your racial choice. I personally have the recovery enchantment on a ring because I change out the mythic when switching to full healer, but keep the same rings, so then I have 2 times recovery. The frontbar traits and enchantments depend on the weapon you decide to use. For dual wield, it should be Nirnhoned and charged with flame and poison enchant. For two-handed weapons, precise with flame enchant. And the back bar should always be infused with berserker, aka weapon and spell damage. Next we will talk about the race choice. In my opinion, Altmer is the strongest option for Arcanist in general, as well as for this build specifically. If you play mostly as a full healer and other content, Breton might be the best choice for you though. I personally picked Dunmer just for roleplay reasons, which is ever so slightly behind Altmer as the stamina sustain is slightly worse. The fourth best would then be Khajiit, and more stamina-based races can also absolutely work, as Arcanist always uses both resources anyway, and you could adjust the sustain accordingly. As the Mundus, we want to be using Thief, as it is simply the most effective for damage, but it's also one of the best for healing, so we aren't losing much there either. For the attribute points, I recommend 60 for Magicka. You could also use them for boosting health, but as I already said, prismatic enchantments make more sense on the Arcanist in my opinion. As buff food, I run Magicka and health, but sustain depends on a lot of factors, so having other options with recovery available is generally a good idea. Potions are quite interesting for the Arcanist. You can change between Essence of Weapon Power and Essence of Spell Power depending on what resource you need. Tri-Restoration can also be necessary sometimes, especially in the really healing intense fights, but you do lose the major crit buff then, so I would try to avoid it. For easier content, I recommend just using the cheap Essence of Stamina or Magicka. Continuing with the blue champion points, I recommend Wrathful Strikes, Backstabber, Thaumaturge, and Biting Aura as the default maximum damage setup. If you need more penetration, you can use Force of Nature, and if you cannot backstab, use Fighting Finesse instead. Other options that I can somewhat recommend on the Arcanist is Wrathful Strikes, Backstabber, Swift Renewal, and Soothing Tide to boost healing over time. This can, under the right circumstances, even result in more damage as you need less burst healing. For the red CP, I mostly play with Celerity, Boundless Vitality, Siphoning Spells, and Bloody Renewal. There are also a lot of good alternatives though, depending on your personal needs, such as Fortified, Rejuvenation, Expert Evasion, Slippery, Bracing Anchor, Sustained by Suffering, or Bastion. Usually it doesn't even make that much of a difference what you choose, but situationally specialized nodes such as Free Dodge Roll can be an absolute game changer. And if you don't need anything that specific, in my opinion, CP that boost sustain are generally strongest. The next section of this video are the abilities. So on our front bar, we of course need Fate Cover, Arcanist's signature ability. For this build, I highly recommend the Pragmatic Fate Cover morph, as it just is a lot easier to keep up healing and support with the shorter version, and the shield also helps a lot with just ignoring incoming damage. Basically, less need to cancel it also results in more damage. To generate Crux and empower Fate Cover, this build uses Cephaliarch's Flail, which is also a strong AoE damage ability in its own right. Now we get to two more situational abilities. As my default setup, I play Rune of the Colorless Pool for the minor vulnerability and brittle, and Fulminating Rune as a strong AoE dot and also synergy. But depending on what my group needs, I might replace one of them with Necrotic Orb. Both morphs absolutely work depending on if you need more healing or more damage. And lastly, we want a weapon ability, either Quick Cloak, Unstable Wall, Endless Hail, or Stampede, depending on what front bar weapon you use. On the healing staff, Combat Prayer is the burst healing ability of choice. It's really strong, versatile, and brings additional support with Minor Berserk, but we don't want to constantly use burst healing for small amounts of damage and to keep up spell power cure, so having the correct healing over time ability is essential. By default, I use Healing Springs, as it is incredibly resource and time efficient, but it is stationary and might not always work that well, so for those really mobile encounters, I recommend using Radiating Regeneration instead. Another option can also be Energy Orb or Echoing Vigor here instead of on the front bar. Then I usually have Siphon Spirit for the Mana Magicka steal. If that is not needed and you feel like another hot might help, you can replace it with one of the previously mentioned abilities. Senna's Empowering Disc is usually a must-have for its 3 important buffs, unless you run with an Arcanist tank using it. And lastly, we have Inspired Scholarship, which first of all deals some damage, but the most important part is that it allows us to generate 3 Crux with only 2 casts of Cephaliarch's Flail, making our rotation significantly more efficient. As ultimates, I recommend Dawnbreaker front bar for the passives, though you can also go with a barrier if you need the additional sustain, and then you have it for emergencies. And on the back bar, as the ultimate we are actually using actively, we can go with the Languid Eye for just damage, Aggressive Horn for support if the tank does not use it, or Barrier or Gibbering Shelter as a defensive ultimate. Moving on to the passives, we of course need our 3 class lines, then the weapons we use, Light Armor, potentially Medium Armor, Fighter's Guild, Undaunted, Magic 8 from Alliance War if you are using Barrier, racial passives, and medicinal use from Alchemy of course. Next up is the rotation. Generally the idea is to use Fate Cover with 3 Crux as often as possible while not dropping healing, support, or other damage abilities. This is basically also what every Arcanist DD currently does. In theory, it is relatively simple. We renew our short duration abilities, for example Combat Prayer, Healing Springs, and Energy Orb, followed by 2 casts of Cephaliarch's Flail and then a Fate Cover. Rinse and repeat while recasting the longer lasting abilities every 2nd or 3rd rotation. When it comes to doing that in combat, it gets a bit more complicated though, as mechanics and incoming damage can force us to alter our rotation. Generally, it is a question of learning the encounters so you know when it is safe to deal damage, so you don't have to cancel Fate Cover. Also important is utilizing phases where you can't or don't need to deal damage for support, and also restoring your resources so you can focus fully or at least more on the damage afterwards. Even with the Velothi Urmage's Amulet, we still want to be weaving. It might not deal relevant damage itself, but it is still important, especially for the healing stuff enchantment. In terms of ultimate usage, we want to time it with the rest of our group if possible, so we get the most damage out of Master Architect, especially with an offensive ultimate. With a defensive one, it is a bit different of course, but coordinating it with burst damage still often makes a lot of sense. Having a huge shield also allows us to ignore certain mechanics and then maximize damage. I generally recommend saving 500 ultimate for boss fights, as using the ultimate in trash is mostly overkill anyways. As the last topic for this video, I will now give you some tips for combining this build with a full healer build for more healing intensive encounters. The most obvious solution is using the armory and just switching to a completely different build. That way there are no restrictions on what you can include in either build, and you can just have any full healer build you want basically. The problem is you need access to an armory assistant and an additional armory slot, and both cost crowns. And this also does not work in arenas, so only for the normal dungeon content. The second solution is creating a full healer build that has as much overlap with this build as possible. That's also what I do, by the way. This does work better for PC due to add-ons making switching CP, gear, abilities, etc. much faster and easier. On console, you unfortunately need to switch everything manually, but it can still be worth doing, I think. So let's get into what you can change with relatively low effort. The gear can mostly stay the same. Like I said, Spell Procure and Master Architect are really strong for any build. The secondary sets I would advise changing though. Pearls of Elnofey is usually your best option, and by changing the necklace, you can get some additional Magicka recovery in as well. Then you can either combine it with a Master or Veteran Restoration Staff, Symphony of Blades, or Season the Inferno. You could also leave the weapons as is, but that's not really ideal. You want to make the Healing Staff your main bar and have the Master Architect weapon as your back bar, ideally with a Destruction Staff. If you need more sustain, changing the buff food is also a good option. Changing CP is another really good idea. It does require a higher CP level though, as you need 100 to 200 additional points, particularly in the blue tree. The most important notes to get are Swift Renewal and Soothing Tide, and if you can change all 4, I would recommend also getting From the Brink and Enlivening Overflow. In the red CP, you might not even need to change anything. I just wouldn't recommend siphoning spells and Bloody Renewal if you don't deal any damage. If you cannot change CP, I would recommend going with a more balanced setup that just works well for both builds. And lastly, for the abilities, the main thing you want to do is replacing all damage abilities, except for the weapon ability, with healing over time. I also recommend Chakram of Destiny to permanently keep 3 Crux active. Don't treat it as a burst heal though, as it is really unresponsive. Your best emergency heal is still Combat Prayer. With all these changes combined, you can absolutely heal any encounter. Sustain can be a bit tight, but if you play proactive, doing a few heavy attacks here and there, and not just spamming burst healing, it should not be a huge issue. But with that, we are done with this video. I hope you will have fun and success with the build. You can find a written summary in the description and also some useful links. If you have any further questions, feel free to ask me in the comment section. I also highly appreciate it if you would like the video or subscribe to my channel. These interactions help my videos get recommended by the YouTube algorithm and thereby reach a wider audience, which would be amazing. Anyways, thank you for watching and bye.